Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode on season three of the Path to the Pros podcast. This is the podcast where I sit down with sports business execs, learning about their journeys, their stories, and the pathway to a successful career in sports business. Today, I'm sat with Joe Stetson, the Chief Commercial Officer at the New York Red Bulls. Joe, thank you for joining the podcast. Pleasure to have you on.
Samir, thanks so much for having me. I'm honored, excited to be part of this podcast.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Right. Look, Joe, diving straight into things. Question I always like to start this conversation with. Take us back to the beginning. Where did your journey in sports first begin?
So my journey into sport, it started at Madison Square Garden. I was a 19-year-old intern. I was working for MSG Networks, which at the time was the home of every sports team in the New York area. It was a really fortunate time for dating myself, but it's pre-Yes Network and pre-SNY. So I had the opportunity to get experience and exposure to every sports team in the market, was really exciting at the time. And I did it in so many capacities. My first internship there was with the programming department, and then I just never left. I had over 2 years left in college, and I was at Rutgers University at the time. I was commuting back and forth sometimes multiple times a day. And after a few weeks into my first internship, I decided, you know what, I want to work here for as long as possible, and as long as they'll keep me. So I was doing everything from being a production assistant to on various live and tape shows to a PR internship, basically whatever kept me relevant and valuable there. And that was my priority, get a full-time job there. And, right around the time, a few weeks before I was graduating, sure enough, a job opened up in the marketing department. I was able to go to the hiring manager and I said I wanted to apply. And she said, Joe, you've been here for 2.5 years. You don't have to apply. The job is yours. And that's how my career started there.
Love it. The world's most famous arena. I mean, there's not many other places that I think a lot of people, at least in the US, but arguably across the world, would want to start their sports career. What was that like out of interest? Just, you know, Madison Square Garden's always in the spotlight. There's, to your point, at the time, you had all of the New York teams were playing there. It must have been on one hand such an exciting and really positive way, I guess, to start your sports business career, but at the same time, I can imagine it would have been a big challenge as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was all I knew, right? And I think I started there so young, and I started there at a time it was kind of like the mid to late 90s, right? And it was just coming out of, the Knicks and the Rangers having so much success. Rangers winning the Stanley Cup, Knicks being in the finals. So I got a chance to be on the wake of all that, and then also, quite honestly, saw some really really challenging years where the Knicks and the Rangers started to struggle for a while, and all the other teams that we were working with, me being fortunate to be on the network side, on the television side, was able to, day by day almost bounce around from sport to team, really picking up where the challenges were with, could have been the Mets or the Yankees. Then the next day working on something with the Devils. It was really an exciting time. And for me, it was all I knew. So starting at that time, but starting in that company, and there was a lot of us, like myself, who were starting their careers there. That a lot of us kind of grew up together in that space, and I ended up being there for almost 12 years.
Yeah, it's a long time as well for your first job. I mean, in any industry, right?
Yeah.
12 years in the first gig that you get out of college is pretty big. um I guess, yeah, to your point, it's difficult to have an alternative perspective when all you know is what you know, right? You know that you're representing Madison Square Garden, everything that you do, and you know that there's, big numbers and big targets and, big ambitions, big goals for the team, for the players, for the business, the back office staff, that you just kind of, I guess, get on with it, maybe for lack of a better phrase. But one New York team to the next, from Knicks to the Nets. How did that kind of transition feel moving over to Brooklyn? And having had 12 years under your belt at MSG, I can imagine that would have been quite an exciting opportunity for you.
Yeah, it was, and it was happening right when I was going back to school. So right around that time, I was getting my MBA from NYU. I was part of the executive MBA program, and I really started to consider, after 12 years being in sports, for the same reason so many of us go into sports, we're passionate about it, we're fans. I started to think, maybe was there a situation where I could see myself working outside of sports. And through my MBA program, I really started to think, all right, maybe I go back to just being a fan and working in a different industry. But sure enough, as things would have it, a mentor of mine from Madison Square Garden, who used to run sales there, Neil Davis, was the chief revenue officer at the Nets, and they just finalized a deal for a naming rights partner for this new building that they were going to build in Brooklyn, and they needed somebody to develop that brand. And he thought of me, and basically convinced me to come on over there, to help establish this Barclays Center brand. So I got a chance to work with him, got to meet some really great people, work under, under Fred Mangione, who was a big mentor of mine as well too, and work under Brett Yormark, and really get to be there at a really interesting time where we were still in New Jersey. We were starting to build the concept of what the Barclays Center was, working very, very closely with Barclays Bank, who was stepping into the US market through this sponsorship, and then also helping to transition the brand from New Jersey Nets to the Brooklyn Nets. And that was during a really challenging time where I would say everybody in New Jersey hated us because we were leaving, and everybody in Brooklyn seemed to hate us because they thought that we were ruining their neighborhood. And so we had an opportunity to really just try a bunch of different things in that process. It was a fun time. It was a challenging time, but I feel like it was my second, MBA experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that time, I mean, for sports in general, when, to your point, the shift from New Jersey to Brooklyn, and, we're not talking New Jersey to Manhattan, right? There would have been a lot of angry New Jersey fans at the time that meant now to go and watch this team play, it's a bit of a way away. But in your role specifically, I guess as a marketing, a senior marketing exec in the organization, how you went about marketing that, of course, was under your responsibility. Just talk us through, I guess, some of the maybe things that you're looking back on that you're really proud of, because you look at the
Yeah.
Brooklyn Nets today, right? And they're a fantastic brand. They've built something incredible. They, successes have been kind of up and down over the years, but at the same time, they've got a powerful brand behind them. So something has worked. If you can kind of maybe give us a bit of a perspective of looking back, some of the things that you're really kind of proud of that you would say maybe have supported the business and getting to where they've got to today.
Yeah, and Samir, I think you hit on it a little bit there too, which is Brooklyn itself, especially at the time we're talking now, 2007. Brooklyn then wasn't what it was today, where, obviously, one of the largest boroughs and some great neighborhoods there. But what we did during that time is really leaned into the brand that was Brooklyn. We had the opportunity, we evaluated it of, is it going to be the New York Nets versus the Brooklyn Nets and so on, and really decided as an organization, and it started from the top with Brett as well too, which was to lean into Brooklyn as a brand in and of itself and really start to build this community that already was super strong and with a large identity. Those that were, grew up in Brooklyn, as well as those that kind of moved into Brooklyn and really saw themselves as Brooklynites, and that, really trying to figure out how the Nets as an organization and really how the Barclays Center as this new arena would be part of the fabric of that community, part of the fabric of its identity. And that was something that was really important that we really focused a lot of our attention during my 3.5 years there, was really trying to lean into Brooklyn and not necessarily take anything away from it.
Yeah. The Van Wagner gig then. So I guess first role, agency side. This must have been, a different perspective. I've always got a lot of appreciation for people that start team side and then go agency side, because I think anyone who works agency side just wants to go team side, or most people do anyway that I speak to.
Mhm.
It's a very different perspective. You bring a lot more knowledge, expertise, know-how to the table because you've been in the environment that these, agencies are pitching business to. How did you find that transition? Because you was there for, a decent amount of time as well.
I loved it. I really enjoyed being on the agency side. Once again, it was another mentor of mine that I followed over there in Scott Epstein, who was there already for a few years. And they were starting to grow their sports entertainment business, especially on the consulting side. And my experience working with Barclays and Barclays Center and the Nets to start to establish the brand for the Barclays Center, we saw that there was an opportunity on the consulting side, as there were a lot of brands that were getting into sports sponsorship as a main key to their marketing campaign and their marketing mix. And in this case in particular, MetLife was evaluating the naming rights of MetLife Stadium, which still was at the time, it was the, New Jersey football stadium at the time, but coming off of Giant Stadium. And there was just a great opportunity for me to utilize the skills and capabilities that from whether it was from Madison Square Garden into the Nets with the Barclays Center, to be able to use those skill sets from being on the other side of the table, being part of that property, being part of the team or the venue side, and being able to see it from the lens, from the perspective of the brand, and be able to help a brand establish success, and utilizing sports as a marketing vehicle. So it was a really exciting time for me. It was great for me too, just coming off of almost 12 years at Madison Square Garden, almost 4 years at the Nets, and really at coming off of a really intense 4 years at the Nets, which were great and educational and all that. Being able to be with an agency that was also starting to grow their business as well too was really exciting for me. So I had an opportunity to work on the MetLife business with MetLife Stadium, had an opportunity to work with a brand with an NBA global sponsorship, with NHL sponsorship as well, and really started to kind of see that diversity that I really enjoyed working at Madison Square Garden with MSG Networks, of being able to any given day, work on one sports property one day or one sport one day, and then another one the next day. I really enjoyed that. And I really found a lot of value and excitement about that when I came back to the agency side.
Yeah. I'm guessing that this was your first role in a not just marketing capacity, right? You're looking at sponsorship. You're probably your first flavor of sales. Is that right?
Yeah, it was, and it's interesting. Like, I found, because of my experience there, and quite honestly too, working with Scott again, who was at Van Wagner, he was somebody that pulled me in when I was at Madison Square Garden, started to pull me into the sales process more and more. There was a story that I remember when I was a excuse me, coordinator at MSG Networks. And it was my responsibility as a young coordinator to manage a lot of the brand integrations that they were doing with a lot of the different sports teams that we were covering. So much of the revenue on the Madison Square Garden side went into the television networks and those telecasts, but they were basically selling a lot of these promotions and that they were creating, the salespeople were just creating on the spot during sales pitches. And I found that it was really challenging for me to execute them. So I went to Scott at the time, while we were at Madison Square Garden together, and said, you know what, I feel like we can improve these. I feel like if I took on more of a role, I could improve upon, how we execute these things. He's like, all right, big guy, like, you want to come to our sales meetings every week? Prove yourself there and have these salespeople start to take you on the pitches. So then you create them, the promotions that you're executing, you then create them and be part of that process. And so through that, I really started to get a lot of exposure and experience on the sales side of things, that even as a marketer, and I always felt that I was a marketer at the time, I was in on pitches, I was creating decks, I was creating presentations and proposals, and I really started to learn the sales process and sales side there. Then when I went to the Nets, working under a Brett Yormark organization, there's always that sales lens as well too, which was really exciting, even as a marketer. And then to your point, at Van Wagner, as we were building this consulting practice, the sports entertainment business, yes, so much of it was marketing and marketing consulting, but a lot of it was on the sales side, business development as well.
I think there's in everything. I love all of that, by the way. It's rare. I don't say rare. It's less frequent that we come across, good marketers that eventually get into sales. It's usually you're a great salesperson. The more senior you get, the more responsibility you start to take on with marketing. But there's one kind of underlying theme in all of that really stands out to me, and it's you are in a marketing capacity, but were putting yourself forward to support the sales team that was then giving you the exposure of working through the sales processes and the whole, partnership development life cycle, which ultimately has then given you the experience to be able to go into a Van Wagner, to be able to, now hold the seat that you're sat in. And I think maybe there's just something that, there's one thing that people do take from that. It's if you are in a role or in a capacity where maybe you want to be doing something different further down the line, and whether this was a, something that you was aware of at the time or not, Joe, but you were consciously or subconsciously taking steps for what your, future self would have been really pleased for, without maybe realizing it. And even if you were realizing it, good on you for doing it. But I think coming forward, speaking to the people around you, speaking to your management team and saying, hey, look, I think we can improve in this. I think I can add value by doing that. Let's work together and see how we can do it. Because it's a lot of people want to do a different role, they want to take on more responsibility, but it's just because I want to do it thing, rather than I can add value here because give me the opportunity there because there's something really really nice in there. I think that a lot of people will be able to take from, and ultimately that's bring it back to the point that's led you to where you are today. How have you found the last 10 years now at the New York Red Bulls? I mean, what are 10 years for soccer in the US? What are 10 years for MLS? What are 10 years for the club? It must be an incredible decade of your career.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. When I was at Van Wagner, I was enjoying it so much. When I had this opportunity to meet with the president, who's still the president, my boss Mark de Grand Pré, who's amazing. Had the opportunity to meet with him, and really was not expecting that I was going to go back to the team side. You mentioned before, the how people transition from teams to agencies. I was really happy being on the agency side. I was not I was not an expert by any means or close to it in soccer, and was expecting just to, and that introduction was done by somebody from another agency that I knew, that connected the two of us. But I was expecting to kind of go into this interview and really then end up pitching another person, that was more into soccer and wasn't as happy as his job as I was at my current job at Van Wagner, to be honest with you. But after meeting Mark for literally a few minutes, and got a chance to understand what his vision was to grow the sport and how he wanted to do it, and getting a little taste of what his style was and what his values were, made me really excited. I said, you know what, I needed to do this. And quite honestly, I started there as a marketing and communications head. And similarly, I think Mark saw in me that there was more sales, in my DNA, than I probably knew myself, and started to transition me into more of a commercial role, which is what I'm in right now.
Love it. And there's one thing I think that you've spoken a few times about, which I'll come back to properly in a moment, because I just want to dive into the kind of last couple of years in a little more detail first. But you've mentioned maybe 5 names or so now since we've jumped onto this call. You're either really good with names or you've got really good relationships. I'm probably going to put it down to the both. But there's one thing that we'll come back to in a moment to really dive into there, and specifically a full circle moment, which I'll let you have the opportunity to talk through shortly. But Fred Mangione, Scott Epstein, a couple of other names that you've mentioned there, people that you've clearly stayed in touch with, maintained relationships with throughout your career. It's really interesting how many people, and you hear this every day in sports, right? Sports is a small industry. It's not what you know, it's who you know. Build relationships, but there are steps I think that people need to take to kind of get there. And I'll come back to that in 1 second. But just one last question for you on the Red Bulls, and I guess MLS and soccer and everything here in the US. That transition, I guess, into the role that you're sat in today, the various different kind of capacities and responsibilities that you've overseen. Just talk to us about, I'm a huge soccer fan. Talk to us about what it's been like being, behind the doors of an MLS team, and the growth of where, soccer in the US 10 years ago is nowhere near what it's like today. Just talk us through what, some of those, whether it be initiatives, projects, whatever it might be that you guys have worked on that's really kind of helped to grow the sport. Because I'm a big advocate for saying, look, MLS wouldn't have grown the way it has done if it weren't for the teams and the teams in the league that have taken the right steps to get there, right? And I think you'd be a great person to maybe speak to that a little.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right. I mean, just over the last 10 years that I've been part of soccer, yeah, I mean, the growth is substantial. And it's part of what excited me about stepping into this space, being able to be part of a sport or a movement, quite honestly, that is, on it, that's ascending, right? And I do think right now, we're at an inflection point with soccer in this country, and particularly also Major League Soccer as well, right? I mean, you have a bunch of factors that are all starting to hit at the right time, right? You have the World Cup coming here in 2026. You have the Club World Cup coming here next year. You have the Olympics going on right now. You have the greatest, soccer player in the world, maybe in history, playing in our league right now, Major League Soccer. And over the last 10 years, you've just seen the growth and interest and awareness about soccer, not just Major League Soccer, but global soccer too, and just how easy it is to consume and be able to find global soccer, top flight, global soccer across the world, whether it's Bundesliga or La Liga or what we're doing right now at Leagues Cup with Liga MX, be able to see all this great soccer from around the world and be able to see how Major League Soccer is starting to compete and becoming more competitive and much better product. So that's been really, really exciting for me as well, and be able to see that and be a part of it. And more importantly, be able to see these next couple of years as being such an important time for the sport to grow. Because the last time the World Cup was here, I mean, it literally birthed Major League Soccer. When it was here in 1994, it helped to create the interest of Major League Soccer to start in 1996. So we're very keenly aware of that. And, as a league and as a team and as being part of a global, soccer network and Red Bull as well too with their other teams, like we view this as a great opportunity that I'm very, very fortunate to be a part of.
Yeah, I love it. It's been even just in the 2 years that I've been out here in the States, just seeing the kind of each month, I feel like each, few months that go by, you just notice there's a bit more of an uptick in interest from fans. People are trying to play more often. I play grassroots pickup soccer, I joined a summer league and all of that sort of stuff. And even the level of kind of competitiveness that you start to see now is great to see, because I was naive in the sense of I came over here when I first moved out and thought, I'm British, soccer's my game or football's my game. These guys won't be anywhere near as good as I am. And honestly, I'm having rings run around me a lot of weekends because the talent out here is great, and it's good to see from that level as well. Nice. I guess bring it back to one thing I'd love to kind of dive into today, Joe, which I think you'd be one of the best people in the market to talk to about this topic is really the idea and the importance of mentorship throughout a career, specifically in sports business, which as we've touched on is a small industry and is an industry where a lot of people need to move left, right, and center across the country, sometimes internationally, to find the right opportunities. You've done a fantastic job at staying in New York or New Jersey over your sports career, and you haven't had to move anywhere for the right opportunities. And whether you think so or not, I personally think from the seat that I'm sat in, a large part of that is probably going to be due to the relationships that you've built, the mentors that you've had around you, and the relationships that you've actually developed on outside of those mentors as well. So I guess for anyone who's listening that maybe doesn't quite understand the concept or the idea or the importance of it, if you can just maybe give us a general kind of overview as, how you kind of define mentorship and the role that you think it plays in the sports business industry.
Yeah, and I'll go back to a comment you made before about, the names that I dropped, so to speak, right? And I'm dropping those names not as a way to impress anyone. It's really more to give credence to the fact that so much, and it's hard for me to discuss my accomplishments or discuss any of my success without including those. And there's probably about another 12 names too that I haven't mentioned yet that I would have loved to have, but I won't. But it's because, quite honestly, you ask about what does mentorship mean to me or how do you define it? I define it as necessary. Like, I think it defines how people approach their role. I always felt that the job has two important aspects. It's what do you do and how do you do it? And far often I'll tell anyone that would listen, like, yes, your performance can be impeccable, but how you do it is important. How many times do you encounter someone, in any job setting who is smart, so capable, but and so good at getting the job done, but impossible to work with,
Right.
right? And so it's finding that balance, of effectiveness and collaboration. And so just going back to mentorship, like I think that falls into collaboration. I think, how do you want to help other people succeed? Above you, below you, your peers, how important are shared goals? I feel that mentorship it's more of a value than a choice. It teaches you values in terms of gratitude and selflessness and teamwork and curiosity. And I think that for me, when I'm looking at people to work with, people I want to collaborate with, succeed with, it's more of a value, for me, that there's that kind of that shared value that we're going to help each other succeed. It's not going to be, I'm going to try to succeed. I'm going to step over you to succeed. It's more of, how do we help each other succeed? And in many cases that ends up translating into, mentoring or being a mentee.
Yeah. And so you're now at the stage where, 20 odd years or so into your career, you've got a great group of mentors around you. You're probably sat in the position where a lot of people look up to you as a mentor as well. Um, how you're in this position that you're in, how do you assess the right sort of things that come up, whether that be challenges, whether it be opportunities that come up in your career, to determine how you kind of leverage some of those mentors that you have in your life, and what are some of the general kind of topics that maybe you would run by them, just I guess for people's benefit that think, hey, you know what, I've got a few mentors around me, but what do I go to them with? How do I approach them with these things?
Yeah, and I think, for me, it's pretty organic, right? Like I think you can be the best person at your job, you can be the smartest, but we can't do this alone. We're not in an industry, and I don't know how many industries this exists, but we're not in an industry where you can do this alone, right? And so you have your kind of your work mentors, you have your personal mentors, like my wife, who's a psychotherapist, is what is somebody that, Stacy is like, keeps my mind straight or helps me to understand the psychology behind it all. But really, I can't think, I'll reverse it for you, Samir. Like, I can't think of a problem that I faced that I didn't, reach out to somebody else to help me. In many cases, it's somebody that's above me, in more cases than not, somebody below me that might be an expert in the area that I might manage, but that person's more of an expert in that specific discipline. To my boss, to somebody outside of my company. I mean, there's rarely any instance of situation, even what we find right now, being a part of a sports team, and you see kind of the league as a resource as well too. Whether it's Teambo at NBA or Club Performance Group at MLS. I mean, just last week there were two instances where I reached out to folks at the league for advice on stuff, right? So you can't go at this alone, right? And so what ends up happening, and you kind of ask where that balance is, like in more cases than not, it shows a little bit of vulnerability and a little bit of humility, that even at no matter what level, we are all going to need to get input, from other folks to especially make some of those important decisions, some of the bigger decisions. And when you manage a large team, as I'm very fortunate to manage a bunch of large teams, I really rely on, my area heads to kind of make those decisions, rather than making those decisions for them. And so, just feeling that this is more of a collaborative approach, for me is what ends up working for me. Might not work for everybody,
Yeah.
but that's what ends up working for me.
It's from what I'm taking from that is always be looking for advice, always be looking for support, always be looking for guidance. Where that support comes from could be from your mentors, could be just from, the people that are sat opposite you in the office. It could be from your wife or your partner or your parents, or maybe even in some instances, your children.
Mm.
It's that idea of having maybe the openness. And I think you used a word there that really kind of stood out to me. It's almost making yourself vulnerable and in a position where people think, the fact that Joe is reaching out to me to ask me for my support, I feel good about that. If I have my team members reaching out to me, whether they report into me, whether I report into, my boss or other people in the office, and they're reaching out to me, there's something there in the idea of helping people out in situations. And that with the good relationships that you have, that they'll come back and help you as well further down the line. I think that's a really important part of the idea of mentorship, that it hasn't got to be someone who's more senior than you that you've always looked up to. It can be from anyone around you at home or at work. You touched on it a couple of times in there. Do you think that there are certain kind of unique aspects about the sports business that make mentorship especially valuable when compared to other industries? And look, don't get me wrong, I know you haven't worked in many other industries, right? So you can't speak to the exact situations there, but just from what you've seen and from what you know.
Yeah, and it's such an incestuous industry, in the sense that um, people do, and you mentioned it before, people bounce around, they bounce around in different markets, but there's that like lineage of leaders in
Yeah.
their coaching tree, much like you have in sports, right? I come from, football, basketball world, so like the Bill Walsh and Bill Parcells and Greg Popovich, coaching trees. You see that here too, right? Whether it's, Fred Mangione and Brett Yormark or Madison Square Garden, there's like these folks like myself that kind of grew up there, and we're still helping each other out and taking care of each other and helping mentees of each other's. Hey, got somebody I want you to meet. Can you help this woman out, or can you help this guy out? And it is, I do think it is unique. So when I was in business school and I got to learn about folks in other industries, right? It didn't feel like there was that togetherness,
Yeah.
of taking care of each other and kind of we're all in this together. There's so many folks that I've met, for teams that are supposed to be my rivals, that we've ended up helping each other out, whether it's in secret or, yeah, because we're supposed to be competing on the pitch, but the reality is we're all in this together. It's especially in soccer, right? Like the whole rising tides lifts all boats mentality, right? There have been many instances where folks that are supposed to be my competitors end up being, some of my, some folks that really, really helped me out.
Yeah. The I think there's one story that I'd love to kind of dive into here, and I touched on it earlier. But Scott Epstein, a name that you've mentioned a few times today, and I'm not sure how
Mhm.
public this is, so let me know if it's not, and we can skim over it. But
Mhm.
Scott is someone that you worked with, or worked for, I should say, at Madison Square Garden, and you've obviously, you guys have maintained a great relationship throughout your career. If you can just give the rest of us the kind of insight as to where things are at now, and what your relationship looks like between yourself and Scott. I think that
Yeah.
people will take a lot of value out of that.
Yeah, no. So Scott, I mean, Scott's a mentor of mine. I mentioned the story about how, he kind of gave me the opportunity as a, marketing coordinator to kind of step into his world and disrupt his world. I never actually worked for him directly, which is interesting. Even though, I followed him around at Madison Square Garden, followed him to Van Wagner. And what was interesting about being at Madison Square Garden, the story that I told you about him putting me in a position to succeed and step outside of my comfort zone, and then determine that, all right, there's a guy that's my mentor. What I found, and I felt really special at the time, when I would go to see him during the week, I found that there was like a line outside of his door of other Joe Stetsons that, also viewed Scott as his mentor. It's very something really, really special about that. But what's interesting though, and he's been a dear friend and a mentor of mine, but I actually brought him on board to help us out on the partnership side almost a year ago as a consultant, and eventually convinced him to come on board full time. And he's now our head of partnerships, and he's now working, leading one of my teams, which is amazing in so many ways. Really amazing that we have somebody at his talent and his level to help shape our partnership business and help improve what we're doing over there. But it is, I mentioned it on LinkedIn, it's a bit of a full circle moment, but I think it also just speaks to where I also see myself eventually too. Like I always tell folks that work on my team, like my hope is that they continue to succeed to a point where eventually I'm working for them,
Yeah.
and I think that that is something that was taught to me by other bosses and other mentors like Scott. Even that story I told you about Scott, like I wouldn't have been able to have done that if I had another boss that was saying, "Hey, Joe, that's not your core responsibility. Like, I don't want you wasting your time with that." There's
Right.
far too many bosses that when put in a position that, I put my boss in at the time, or bosses at the time to say, hey, I'm going to focus on this area of the business because it's going to improve things. They very well could have been territorial and said, nope, you can't do that. But it was them giving me that pathway to walk through that door that Scott opened for me. They played a huge role in that, and I'm really appreciative of that. But that's, kind of goes in my, decades of being in this business. Those are the things I think about how I want to provide pathways for people that work. I say for me, but it's really that work with me.
I love that. I love that. And honestly, I can't think of many other instances where the relationship or a mentor, mentor mentee relationship has gone full circle like that. It's brilliant, honestly. To your point earlier, sports is an industry where people love to help people out. I've recruited across 5 different industries in the past, and this is probably the one industry where people genuinely want to help their friends, and you can see that there's that togetherness. And so having that situation happen to you and to Scott must be must be incredible to now both be in the seats that you sat in. I guess I touched on it a little earlier, but the idea of going from being the being the mentee to becoming the mentor. How have you found that transition as you've naturally developed further in your career? You would have had, you mentioned earlier, you've managed various large groups of teams. How have you kind of found that different perspective of actually being leaned on for guidance rather than going to people for guidance, because that's also a shift in experience, and maybe it happens naturally, and maybe there's some conscious thought process that needs to go into it. But would love to get your take there.
Yeah, and it gets probably, it gets harder and easier as your as your career develops, right? And it's got to be the right environment, for that to occur. And I told you about when Mark, who's our president of the Red Bulls, interviewed me, and the vision that he had about how he wanted to lead this organization and grow our business. It was kind of creating this open atmosphere where everybody, and whether that stemmed from the world of Red Bull because he
Yeah.
came from there, or whether it was just his value, which I believe it very much is part of his being, of just creating this atmosphere where everybody's learning from each other, everybody's curious, everybody is trying to get better, together. And so to answer your question, like, it is harder as your days get more jam-packed with meetings, right? And there's so many folks that I want to be able to spend more quality one-on-one time with. So sometimes it's more of like organic walking by the hallway and stopping for 15 minutes. But I see how Mark does it, where he knows everybody in the organization. He knows their personal life. He knows what they're working on. I still feel like, in my role, that's something to aspire to be able to do, to be able to walk by somebody in the hallway and know what his accomplishment was this past week, and be able to celebrate it, but also be able to help them with a problem that they might be having. What he's shown me and many of the leaders here is that, you almost start every one-on-one with, how can I help? you know, and and that truly, it helps obviously that individual, but it helps us as an organization because we all have a bunch of barriers, and sometimes we're afraid to ask the people above us, for help, as well as, people below us too. So creating that environment has made it easier for me here, probably more than anywhere else, to be able to try to make myself available. Once again, I I tend to think that I'm failing daily and making myself available because there's only so many hours in the day. But my hope is that that everybody that works within the organization, not just those on my team, feel like I could be a resource for them when needed.
Yeah, I think there's the idea of there's a natural environment where you can provide guidance, advice, support, one-to-ones, monthly check-ins, yearly reviews, whatever it might be. I quite like the idea of the unnatural scenarios, which could be walking down to grab lunch, right? And for whatever reason, it's completely unplanned by the person that you're going with, and they start telling you about how much of a terrible weekend they've had, or it's one
Mhm.
of the biggest challenges they're facing right now and trying to close this deal over the line. And you talk through it kind of on the fly. And I always find more value in those off the cuff conversations than okay, let's sit down and get to the root of the problem that you've got. I find that that's more, professional development than it is, mentorship and guidance. So I think that's an interesting point there. Would you say there's any, when I think about the past and I think about the guidance and advice that I've had from some of my mentors, there are a couple of things that really kind of stand out for me that I've always taken into account when I've been assessing opportunities, when I've been, working on any given project. Is there a particular kind of piece of advice from a mentor that has really stuck with you throughout your career that, whenever it has come to certain situations, this one, whether it be statement, quote, piece of advice has always come to mind?
Um, there's so many. There's so many. But I do think, even with something that I mentioned before, um, about, what you do and how you do it. I think actually it was somebody from Madison Square Garden, Barry Watkins, who ran so many areas of it, who actually simplified it for me, over a meal once. He basically broke that down for me. And I do think that that matters. It really simplifies it, right? Like where, you have folks that can be in one bucket or the other in terms of they do their job really, really well, but how they do it is not necessarily, the way that that the environment that you're working in needs, right? And sometimes it's the opposite. So I think that that was really, really good advice that that I got from him. And something else too that I just kind of learned from all the stories I shared with you too is that everybody has value, no matter what level. And you're gonna, and you can get some of the greatest ideas from an intern, from a C-level executive at a completely different area, and so on. And by understanding that everybody really can provide value, I think really kind of opens up your mind to a lot of things. And quite honestly, too, like, and you mentioned too, being able to see how people return it back, right? And those full circle moments, right? There are far too many instances where there was that intern or that coordinator or somebody in a different department that I had a brief moment with, and or tried to have a real moment with, and saw that person just from afar. We have LinkedIn now, so you could see people's careers progress, and you're seeing this person just shoot up to rise into so many levels where eventually I'm like, oh, you know what? We're probably going to end up doing work together.
Yeah.
And I hope he or she remembers that, when we worked together years ago. So there are those opportunities too. It's not just kumbaya, rainbows and unicorns. There's also strategic impacts of it as well too. That is just the reality of networking.
Yeah. I love that. The whole idea around a good idea can come from anyone is something I've always lived by. I hire people and on their first day, I'm almost pleading with them, look, anything that that's worked really well in the past or any ideas that you've got, like bring them to the table. I want to know about them. And that idea of, yeah, like I said, a good idea can come from anyone is something that I'm a huge, huge advocate for. Last question for you here, Joe. Any advice, I guess, that you've got to, whether it be young professionals, whether it be people that are, somewhere through their journey in the industry who are, looking for mentorship, who are looking to have, a group of mentors around them, but may not know where to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think, listen, and this industry, fortunately, unfortunately, is the only industry I know. But this jobs in this industry are much bigger than the people, right? Than the individual person, right? And so, whether it is, volunteering to put yourself out there to do things that are outside your comfort zone, to get as much experience and exposure as possible, recognizing too that, that everyone has value, and that you can get that additional experience, that additional exposure from really anyone and at all levels. And then how you continue to utilize those learnings and stay curious to be able to stay connected. I think all those things are related to each other, right? Where it's so important to just to show that you are willing, especially if you're starting in this business. So many of us kind of start with a mentality or a vision of what my first job's going to be or what my first job in sports is going to be, and it's got to be in this sector of it's got to be with a team, and it's got to be in this department. And they lose sight of the fact that, you know what, you can start in ticket sales, you could start in operations, you could start, slinging hot dogs and concessions, right? Like,
Yeah.
and any foot in the door that gives you that initial experience, and then from that experience opens you up to exposure to different people in different departments. It's somewhat autobiographical what I'm saying right now, because that's what's worked for me. But I do find that um, leaving yourself open for each of those steps is what's truly going to make somebody stand out.
Love it. Love it. There you have it, guys. Advice from one of the best. Honestly, Joe, you and I haven't known each other for too long, but every time we reconnect, there is a breath of fresh air to reconnect with. I can clearly see why you've had the opportunity to have so many good people around your career so far, and wish you and the Red Bulls all the best for the rest of this season. And yeah, thank you for joining us today. It's been great having you on.
Thank you, Samir. Hearing you say that, I mean, I feel the same way about you. Every time we connect, it feels like we've known each other for decades. So I appreciate you. I appreciate you putting me on here and letting me tell my story.
Love it. Love it. Thanks everyone for listening. We'll be back next week for another episode.